It's 1965. The Prime Minister is Harold Wilson, and there's a debate about whether or not to have a referendum about our relationship with the European Union, or the EC as it then was. And BBC Two, that new fledgling radical form of broadcasting, gets a new boss, David Attenborough. So David Attenborough has been at the forefront and the centre of the BBC story since then. I had the great honour recently of interviewing Alan Bennett, and he said he was pretty irritated because he was regarded as some kind of cuddly national icon, whatever he did. And he said, if I am caught pitchforking Dame Judi Dench to death, I will still be regarded as some kind of wretched teddy bear. So David Attenborough has the same kind of position, if I may say so, when it comes to the broadcasting world. But there's a lot to talk about, so I'm going to crack on. David, after Brexit, I mean, you now speak on behalf of a lot of environmentalists, people concerned with nature and wildlife, both here in Britain and around the world. And you suggested that whatever we thought of the vote of the referendum to remain or to stay, now we have opportunities to rethink our attitude to wildlife and the environment generally. Could you expand a little bit on that, please?
Well, the first thing is to please the dismal Jimmies. I mean, we can say that we will lose the EU subsidies for the farmers, and that will be one thing that will affect our countryside very much. There may be others, which I'm not really an expert on this subject, but there are other things that we can know, and that is that we can actually tailor-make, we can measure our own legislation to fit our own circumstances. And there are quite a lot of circumstances in our own reserves, which we probably know more about than anybody else in Brussels or anywhere else. And there is also fishing policy and declaring just where you can fish and where you can't fish. Without being told what to do, we happen to know where they should be. So there is give and take. And by and large, I would say there is a substantial number of people within the conservation movement who think that maybe the chance to tailor-make our own legislation, as far as our reserves are concerned, is a good thing. It's
going to give us a completely different kind of politics that it's hard now to imagine, I think. It's going to be a world in which what the RSPB says about something is going to matter much more than it has at the moment. We're not going to be looking away at Brussels or anywhere else for the real legislation to emerge. You mentioned fishing. I know that around New Zealand they had a complete no-fish area for a while, and the reserves of fish rocketed again. They showed that quite after only 10 years or so, you can rebuild stocks much more quickly than we thought was possible. Is that the kind of thing that we might see once we have control of our own fishing areas? We can then have those kind of conversations for the first time?
I think so. Of course, New Zealand is a different situation, really. I mean, it is much more isolated in terms of the sea, of the ocean, than Britain is. And we have very close relations across the channel. So those policies on the East Coast are much more likely to be affected by what's happening in Europe than anything in New Zealand.
We had some interesting stories in the papers over the last few days about the devastation being caused to our tree population in this country by all sorts of imported products, mainly for garden centres and so on, bringing new bugs. Is that the kind of thing where, as a properly independent country, again, we can be much tougher about what we bring in?
Well, we could, but we also really need to collaborate very closely with the people in Europe on this particular issue. I mean, what you're talking about, I think, is a beetle that was imported from China. And we need to collaborate very much with our colleagues across the channel as to the legislation that's going to come. Which way does this come? We want to present a united front on that.
And so, in the world after Brexit, it's a question of being good Europeans outside the EU. And that's a message that we have to get across to people.
I would think so, yes. I mean, we have no alternative. If we're going to go out, then we must make the best of it. And there will be conservationists who say, we know in more detail in terms of fine-tuning how to arrange the legislation to deal with this particular problem than anybody living elsewhere.
And there will presumably be areas where we are, as it were, less conservation-minded, perhaps than the rest of the EU. There's a big difference between us and them at the moment on GM foods, for instance.
Yes.
And so it's perfectly possible that a Britain outside the EU would be much more liberal in terms of its attitude to allowing GM crops than the EU. So it's going to be both ways. We've seen you again and again and again in remote parts of the world, staring eyeball to eyeball at extraordinary creatures. Most recently, we've heard a lot about global warming from you and the Antarctic and the Arctic. Can I ask you a very sort of, I suppose, simplistic question, which is, how do you keep cheerful given the catastrophic nature of climate change that you have been telling us about?
I don't think you've got any alternative, really. I mean, I don't think you improve matters by going around being dismal Jimmy all the time. I suppose if there are things to be done to gain hope, I mean, the first thing to say is that I cannot imagine time in the whole history of Homo sapiens when the human population of the world has got to agree on anything, ever, except one. And that was with the ozone layer. When British Antarctic Survey detected the thinning of the ozone layer and was able to demonstrate that if that went on, people were going to fry. And something had to be done. The course was clear. It was CFCs in refrigerators and so on. Legislation was produced. It was stopped. And that hole in the ozone layer is now healing. Well, that's something. It's not much, but it is something. It shows that it can be done. And there is, to my perception at any rate, an understanding all around the world now, in China, and even America, that something has to be done. And the really infuriating thing is that actually there are quite simple things that could be done. We use something like 1/200th part, the whole of the human race, 200th part of the energy that comes to us from the sun. If we could harness just 1/200th part of that energy, we would solve all the problems of CO2 and global warming. And we actually know the basic science in order to solve those problems. What is needed now is a concerted attempt by the research scientists of all the developed nations to work out a route map in which you can see where the sticking points are, where the difficult bits are, allocate those to the nations, say, put your top boys on this, and solve the problems of gathering it more effectively, transporting it, extremely important, smart cables to be able to transport power, and storing it. If you did that, you wouldn't have to say to people, stop doing this. You would say, it's cheaper. It's cheaper.
It's cheaper and it's better and it's cleaner.
And that's how you encourage people to do things, by reward and not by stick.
As our most prominent environmentalist voice in this country, therefore, are you optimistic that we have the scientists, we have a pretty, not entirely, but a pretty informative and powerful media in this country, and a lot of understanding about issues like global climate change in this country? Do you see us, after exiting the Union, as being one of the prime voices around the world for a radical change in energy policy?
Well, it is in so much, there's no party politics in this, there's no favoured nation in this. We are all in it together, and whatever happens about Brexit, that is beside the point.
I'm just interested, because people say, what kind of country are we going to be? What sort of country are we going to be? And I hear from you the possibility that we could be a very, very progressive and important voice in the world on these really big issues.
Well, we could be.
I mentioned the media a moment ago, which allows me to return to the subject of the BBC, 1965. You took over as controller of the BBC Two then, a totally different media environment, relatively little competition. If you were suddenly transported back and had to do the same kind of job now, how would you regard it? As an impossible one?
Yes, I'll put in my resignation straight away.
Because
I mean, it is a hideous problem at the moment.
Yes.
There isn't any question about that. And of course, I've been in television for a long time, since the early 50s, since 52. And the thing was that in 1952, we were effectively, in all intents and purposes, we were the civil service. BBC was the civil service. We were there for life. We had pensions. The salaries of the Director General and the controllers of networks were in 4 figures, if that. And everybody knew where they were. But it obviously couldn't go on like that. I mean, it couldn't go on in today's world that you could have a civil service attitude to things like that. I mean, we certainly knew what we thought viewers should have. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But we haven't made the full journey to the commercial world, which is what we are in. We are making it slowly and painfully, and the shift from those sort of attitudes and those sort of policies is very painful, and it's been going on for 40 years.
And in terms of the different parts of the BBC's mission, the part to educate has, in many people's view, been pushed back by commercialisation and the new media environment. Is that a big danger for us?
Yes, but communications have increased so much. I mean, when Jenny Lee was talking about the University of the Air and that sort of thing, I was running BBC Two, and BBC Two was going to take the programmes of the University of the Air. And I remember meeting Jenny Lee to talk about these problems and said, look, there is a problem, Secretary of State. I mean, the fact is, we have one lecture room, and we have it for only 2 or 3 hours a day, and you're expecting to put every subject that you keep telling me we should be doing in that one lecture room. And of course, then they said, oh, well, there are talking books, and there are different ways of correspondence courses and so on. But the BBC's got to pull its weight, which it did, and it had a very good education department. But now, that's prehistory. I mean, we don't need any of that. And for that extent, the sort of role that the BBC had in spreading, as it were, lessons, lectures, has disappeared. It's a much more effective ways of doing that through the internet.
I can remember my mother staring at a little black and white screen with and doing her OU degree very, very vividly.
Absolutely.
Afternoon. But we are in this. You have worked. You've done some wonderful films for Sky and other broadcasters too. ITV has some relatively competent political interviewers. not quite as successful as the BBC at the moment. And so forth. We have Netflix making extraordinarily well-written and very often British-biased dramas. Would it be such a terrible thing if the BBC vanished?
Oh, yes. Oh, there's no doubt about that. I mean, the phrase which colleagues of mine in the other sections of the ministerial would say is that the BBC keeps us honest, and that encapsulates a lot of thought and a lot of implications. The BBC can set standards of veracity, of responsibility. Taste is a very difficult thing, and I won't necessarily say that it succeeds in that, but the others it can do. And so the BBC has to be there and has to do things that others don't tackle because they don't think it's worth it commercially at the moment. And you can see, if you look back at popular programmes that have become very, very popular and so on, that the BBC pioneered them again and again and again and again. And when I was running BBC Two, the nice thing about it was that I actually said, what we are here for is to do programmes that nobody else is here for. And when somebody came along and said, you've got a big success with this programme about what?
Cakes. Cakes, shall we say.
I was trying to avoid my cake. But if they do, no, I was thinking of something that hadn't been popular and was.
Yeah.
Like archaeology, for example.
Yes.
Then you could say, okay, that's fine. Go and do it. That's fine. Give me a chance to do something else and something new. And it's not only in subjects, in terms of format, in terms of style and those sort of things. And that is invaluable. And also, there's a lack in other sections of television to take the long view. I mean, one of the things which BBC Two, if I may say so, did very well was to do big, serious programmes, take serious subjects, run 31-hour parts and do it, And that requires 3 years.
Yeah.
And there's a great reluctance elsewhere to do on those sort of projects. Who knows what's going to happen in 3 years' time? Well, the BBC might say the same, actually, but nonetheless, it's not saying it. It didn't say it then. It's not doing it at the moment. There's a tendency to shorten that sort of span until you get to the ultimate absurdity, which we know about, when they say we present a new 2-part series.
Oh, yeah. Or in my case, I managed 3 parts, I think. Nevertheless, so what you're saying partly is the BBC has to remain ambitious, but also experimental and take risks. Otherwise, what's its point? It's got to be doing stuff that purely commercial television companies would shy away from or flinch from. I put it to you, we're not doing nearly enough of that at the moment.
I quite agree. I mean, the BBC has got a magnificent record of serious music, has it not?
It certainly does.
And certainly in radio, and that remains. But television used to do quite a lot about serious music, not so long ago. It's a long time since I saw anything ambitious.
I fear if I'm watching it, if I'm going to an obscure concert or whatever, it'll be on Sky Arts for these days very often.
Well,
I'm sorry to swear.
You may be right, but I don't see enough of Sky Arts to
see that.
To speak.
So, sort of thinking about what the BBC can and should do. I mean, I've, like you, but not so in nearly distinguished a way. I've done lots of documentaries with BBC people in Bristol and in London and elsewhere. And one of the things that's happened to the BBC is because of the pressure to outsource more and more of what we do. The inside the BBC people, the producers, the writers, the directors in documentaries have by and large been got rid of. And I think we have no in-house arts or history documentary making facilities left in England, which seems to me to be a terrible moment.
Yes, and I would also say that there is nowhere, even within the BBC, where what you might call house style is actually cherished, where house standards are cherished. You're in the BBC more than I am now, but my impression is there somebody somewhere of authority who gets documentary producers to say, look, do you not realise when you did that you have actually cut in a question which is then actually being repeated by the person who's already in shot doing the interview?
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely simple
basic
things.
craft rules.
Yes,
craft,
expertise, standards, production standards. I miss them, and I miss other standards too. But at the moment, I'm talking about them.
Of course, I suppose people might say very easy for people like us to criticise, but the management of the BBC is constantly getting flack from the rest of the media for reasons we all understand. And above all, we're in this situation where everyone says month by month, year by year, the licence fee, which sustains you all, is not itself sustainable. So can we talk a little bit about that funding model? Because
that is often stated as a blank statement. I do not believe it to be the case.
You think this is sustainable?
I think that a lot of people I talk to, and I hope I'm not too cliquish, but a lot of the people actually think they're delighted to pay the sum for what they get from the 4 networks, radio networks, and 3 or 4 television networks. They recognise it's the biggest possible bargain in Britain.
I put it to you, though, that certainly people in their 20s and below, when I say I work in television, if I say that, they don't really know what I mean anymore, because they don't turn to the big broadcast channels. They just don't. They use everything on demand. And it was said, I think, quite recently by one of our competitors, I think somebody working for Netflix, who said the great success of the BBC iPlayer has almost demolished the case for the BBC, because it's, the idea of channels is vanishing. People expect it on demand, and therefore they're not really aware whether they're watching ITV or Sky or Netflix or the BBC.
That may be so in the long term, but one of the extraordinary things when you look at the statistics is that it is not so in the short term. That channel loyalty is absolutely extraordinarily deeply ingrained, and that you can put a show on BBC 4 and nobody will look at it, and you put it on BBC 2 or your BBC 1 and it gets a big audience. And of course there are arguments, there are inheritance from previous programs and so on. But fundamentally, there are people, I know people who say, oh, I just watch ITV, I don't watch BBC. And the other way around too. But audience loyalty, it's the way people go in, and my bet is that there are an awful lot of people who only watch at Netflix. I mean,
that's right.
Whether that is going to extend, but loyalty, channel loyalty still exists.
One of the, I guess one of the problems about the new world that we're all working in is because Netflix and Amazon and others put so much money into really, really good, high quality and often brilliantly written drama series that can go on for 10 or 20 or 30 episodes. The BBC feels it has to do the same kind of thing, and sometimes very, very successfully. But maybe that seems to be tilting the balance of budgets away from, as it were, documentary and factual political television and towards drama. We're becoming perhaps a slightly too drama-fixated media culture generally.
Well, that could be so, but actually I would have, had you not said that, argument which I agree with, I would have said, of course, the trouble with ITV is that they won't put all the money into natural history programs.
Yeah.
You know, if they only thought and really wanted to spend 3 years and £3 million on natural history program, they could give us a body blow. So why don't they? I don't know.
I have no idea.
They're
looking for a vigorous young presenter to take it through. Which leads me to one of the questions I've always wanted to ask you, which is, I mean, you've been responsible for some of the really, really big series that have changed people's view of things. So, Civilization or Life on Earth, which is closer to your heart?
Oh, I have to know. Yes. Well, I mean, Civilization has a very close place in my heart. Because it was the first of those 13-parters.
Was it really hard to persuade the Director General at the time to spend all that time and money on it?
He didn't know.
He didn't know?
How did he know?
Those were the days.
In those days, you had a programme allowance, I had a programme allowance, and I had to produce programmes, and at the end of it, that was the money. And if I chose to deploy my facilities and funds in that way, it was entirely up to me. That was what I was there for. And the 13-parter, which Civilization was the first, wasn't a thing which I decided to do, and I thought it was a format worth having. Mainly, I think, because as a child, I subscribed when I was about 12, I suppose, 14, to a thing called The Outline of History by H.G. Wells, which was a part
I know it well.
And I used to wait for the letterbox for this thing to come through. God, we're up to Henry VIII.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes,
you know?
yes.
And that market was not being dealt with at all in television. So I also wanted to do, I mean, the other parts of Civilization reasons were to do with colour and quality of that. But that was the first idea, and that it worked was a great relief to me.
And of course, it was a slightly different era. That was still the era when one absolutely self-certain gent in a tweed jacket with one hand in his pocket could tell us what was what and explain the Vikings didn't really have any culture, and we would sit along and nod and be informed. These days, it's a much more rebarbative kind of culture. People will argue back, I guess.
Yes, I will defend Civilization if it needs it.
It doesn't.
On this question of being Mandarin or whatever it is. I mean, the thing is, do you actually think that Michelangelo was a great sculptor? Do you actually think that Bach was a great composer? Do you think Shakespeare was a great writer? Why? These programs will tell you. It wasn't about, this Civilization wasn't about arcane stuff or specialist stuff about Cézanne Cubism or whatever. It was about what the very foundation blocks of the society in which we live. And I don't object to people telling me about examining those things who know more about it than I do.
Absolutely, but it was from a world in which comparative culture, comparatives didn't matter so much, where it was possible to make really big value judgments and say, this is greater and better and deeper than that.
Yes.
And all I'm saying is that these days, make those kind of judgments and you run straight into a wall of hostility.
Yes, and that is to be, in my book, it's to be regretted. The notion, a member of this house actually said, I don't wish experts to tell me what to do.
He's not with us, I think. We've had enough of experts.
That's right. That's what they said.
Yes. Can I turn to the sort of tone of the culture at the moment? Because one of the other things that's endlessly discussed is the tone of national debate. And we saw a pretty angry period during the referendum and indeed afterwards. I certainly noticed as a BBC employee that there are groups of people on the left and on the right in politics who seem to inhabit kind of closed worlds and are completely hostile to anyone who disagrees with them or the centre, and really in particular have a go at the BBC. I wonder whether you think that the atmosphere of public debate generally has become coarser over the decades, not because of one debate or another debate, not because of Brexit, but because there seems to be something in the way people use social media which encourages little worlds where everybody agrees with each other and everybody hates those on the outside.
Oh, well, you tell me. I mean, do you think at question time that people shouting over one another when they're trying to is a good thing or a bad thing?
A bad thing, quite clearly, yes.
Yes. On the other hand, looking at my own soul, I'm looking at this and I think, oh, it's getting rather interesting. And so, but nonetheless, the fact is that the routine and politeness of conversation and discussion has taken a knock in these days.
So this is really what I'm getting to. So should the BBC, among the things the BBC is there for, should it be a place where sort of civility and courtesy remain, even if the rest of the media are starting to get angrier and, in a sense, more interesting, more vivid because they're angrier?
Well, I believe that there should be a platform where people can put views which are not the majority. Yes.
Final sort of BBC thought. We've got now 3 or 3.5 television channels. We've got a lot now of radio channels. One of the big problems, I think, for any Director General, for anyone running the BBC, is how much you keep expanding. I know this is a great political controversy. Should the BBC have a website which has recipes on it and all kinds of political websites and so forth? Is there a point at which the BBC, I can remember George Osborne describing it as having imperial ambitions, where the BBC has to be pretty modest and say, this is what we do, we stick to our last, we don't try to expand into other areas?
Yes, I think that is a possibility, and I'm certain that politicians believe it to be a responsibility. I mean, it seems to me that members of this House are hypersensitive about the BBC, and almost by definition, 50% or whatever it is bound to be. And it is quite true that in my time, in the 50s and 60s and so on, the BBC was expanding. It did actually think that it wanted publishing. The BBC books should be made by the BBC and the profits come into the BBC. Well, the reason that the publishing industry said that was terrible was quite seriously because you could see that the publicity that the BBC could give to its own books put the other publishers at a grave disadvantage.
Yes.
And so it was decreed that the BBC books should be put out. And the BBC is no longer
a publisher.
Well, it's no longer a publisher, no longer a majority holder. And the same thing you could say to all sorts of things, which I accept that the BBC should concentrate its efforts on broadcasting, on sound and television.
To which I suppose that the problem is that we now live in a world where what is broadcasting has become a question, to the extent to which on my Twitter feed there are lots and lots of little clips from bits of broadcast, things that could be regarded as broadcast but have not been put out by any broadcasters. When you go onto a website, you'll see bits of film, you'll see bits of text, and so forth. Therefore, the question of what is broadcasting and what is not broadcasting is a difficult, fast-moving technological and philosophical question.
Yes.
And if we don't move into these areas, a lot of people inside the BBC, well, you're going to be left behind. You're going to be finding all the kids are watching different kinds of things that we no longer produce.
Well, I think that is correct, that the BBC has to and in fairness, of course, the BBC's history is always of being in the forefront of these kind of developments.
Yes.
And so it should be so. But the time will come when the BBC say, okay, well, we publicise that, we may now withdraw from it.
A certain innate modesty and not too much appetite.
Without wanting to be too monopolistic. I mean,
Yes.
and I think so, yes.
Yes. Final question, if I may, before we open to questions from the floor. The BBC is looking for a new chairman at the moment of this new body that's going to oversee the BBC. They don't seem to have a lot of takers at the moment. In a parallel, no, I'm not going to ask that question. But in a parallel world, if some idiot like myself suddenly decides, I'm going to go for that, what would your advice to them be about how to protect and cherish the BBC? How to give the BBC the best future it could possibly have over the next 10 years? You said, my boy, here's your advice. What is it?
You know, I'm quite sure that I don't know a sentence or even a paragraph that's going to answer that. I am absolutely persuaded that the BBC is a place where sanity and where good judgment and civilization can be protected and exercised. How you would find something to put on a Christmas cracker which would tell him what to do, I don't know.
Very good answer. Thank you very much indeed, Sir David Attenborough. Now I'm going to round of applause. Now, you don't often get an opportunity like this, so this is your chance to ask Sir David your own questions. I will, there's a lady here at the front, and I will just, yes, you just stand up. And is there a microphone? There is a microphone. It is the RTS, after all. It'd be pretty terrible if there wasn't a microphone.
Yes, hello, I'm Ross Scott from the House of Lords. Going back to the question of climate change, I wanted to ask you if you were one of those who agreed with the proposition that the BBC's coverage of climate change had failed to reflect the balance of scientific opinion because it was so concerned about impartiality. And I wonder if you'd like to say a word or two about that specifically and then generally about the impartiality question.
Whatever they did, there would be somebody who would think it was either too early or too late. Myself, I thought that they had it about right, because having said that, I am now justifying myself because I was involved in that. And I had to decide how far I would go on saying climate change was responsible for this, that, and the other. And I remember exactly the moment, actually, when I decided that I could now feel that I could say positively that the world was warming due to humanity. And that was a professor of climatology from the United States in a conference in Belgium somewhere, who showed a whole series of graphs about the content of what there was in the upper atmosphere and plotted that against population and plotted that against the Industrial Revolution. And I had no doubt after that 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 was the case. Now, there will be plenty of people who could say, and maybe they're right, that that was too late in the day. But the one thing you did know was that if the BBC had gone too early, it might have interfered with the whole deal. The BBC actually has quite a good record on these sort of things. The BBC, when I joined in the mid-50s, there was a remarkable doctor called Dr. Fletcher, who did programs, medical programs, and the BMA wouldn't allow him to use his name. It was just called the television doctor. And he was absolutely convinced that there was a link between smoking and cancer. And he was treated abominably by the medical fraternity. And the BBC stuck by him And that is a feather in the cap of both the BBC and in particular Dr. Fletcher, who was a noble, noble soul and who suffered as a consequence. But when you get these big things, it is like climate change. It's very difficult to get it right. And I would say, by and large, it wasn't bad.
Do you think where you have, as it were, a clash over what is truth, where you have a bunch of scientists saying this is clearly happening, but some other scientists saying no, it's not, or you have misinterpreted the data, the BBC has an obligation to go 50-50 or 70-30 or whatever?
No, you see, truth is not very democratic in that sense. It isn't good enough to say only 50% of the scientific community believes this and 50% believes that. Therefore, we'll give equal time. I mean, it could well be that it's 80%. It's a small 20% that has perceived the truth before others do. More than likely that it happens that way, and that's what you have to protect.
Yeah. Any other questions, gentlemen? Our chair.
Okay, you mentioned Netflix and Amazon services earlier on, and the BBC iPlayer. When the loophole was closed on people watching television programmes on their iPads, so they have to pay the licence fee to watch BBC programmes either live or on catch-up, there was a great story in the press about BBC detector vans that would go out and sort of detect people using their iPad, which seemed slightly nonsensical. And someone said, well, why don't you just have a PIN code that you put in that proves you're a licence fee payer? To which the kind of response you sometimes get from people at the BBC is, oh, but that makes licence fee payers subscribers, and we don't want subscribers. But in the future, do you think it would be smart for the BBC to say, you have your PIN code number as a licence fee payer, you can watch BBC programming live and on catch-up for a limited period of time, and then after that, if you wish to pay a further fee to have full access to the back catalogue or other things that aren't provided normally by the BBC, then you can do that too, and that's just a sensible way for the BBC to work in a digital age.
I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, because it's a question of mechanics, isn't it? It isn't a question of morals that we're talking about. It's a question of practical mechanics as to how do you do it. And I don't have enough evidence one way or another to know about that.
But I think it's interesting. I find it very interesting you've answered the question in that way, because I think you're right. It is a mechanical question, but I think some of the response we get from well, no, not directly from the BBC, but indirectly, is that it's a moral question. They don't morally like the idea of licence fee payers being BBC subscribers. That's not how they see the relationship.
What is, I think, makes almost everybody working inside the BBC uncomfortable is the apparently heavy-handed nature of some of the enforcement processes on people who don't pay their licence fee. Nobody feels happy about it, and everybody would like to see a neater and easier way of doing these things. And given that people pay all sorts of things, in all sorts of ways on cards of one kind or another, it doesn't seem unreasonable. Yeah. Lady Bonham Carter.
I think our new Foreign Secretary was waxing lyrical about how wonderful the BBC was. Yes. I was agreeing with him on this occasion. Soft power, superpower, I think he said. Has it not surprised you through your years, Sir David, as both on screen and off screen, the degree to which some politicians seem to have it in for the BBC? And do you, with your sort of years of wisdom, have an explanation for this? Because it seems to me a very, very surprising fact.
In my experience, the opposition, at my time, the opposition was all in favour of the BBC because the government had a big majority in the House, and one thing and another, and it had also control over a lot of the media, and the BBC was the one place where the opposition did have a say-so. And of course, I was also there when there was a change of government, and suddenly the opposition were now in power, and within about, I think, 6 months, could have been 5 or 7, but within 6 months, you could give them the same speeches and just swap them over.
Chris Haskins, I was slightly surprised about your comments at the beginning about the environment and the opportunities from Brexit, particularly with regard to fishing. I live in the Humber, and fishing is of great interest. It seems to me that actually working across Europe on environmental issues is absolutely critical in the interdependence, and particularly on fishing. The fishing policy has been very controversial over the years, but actually it's delivering now. And the worst thing we could have, I think, now is to break up the arrangement that we have with other countries on it.
Well, we have the option, do we not? That is the point, that we can look at it from our point of view and see which of the arrangements we wish to make with the EU and which we don't. And I wouldn't pronounce on what they are because I don't know. But what I'm saying is that we now have the opportunity to see where it would be in the national interest to change the legislation and where we can keep it as it is, or as it were, produce a carbon copy and say that's what we will abide by as far as the EU is concerned.
Yeah, there's a danger that self-interest takes place, national self-interest takes predominance over international public interest.
Well, the problem about internationalism in natural history and the natural world, as I'm sure we all know, is that there is very little nationalism, actually. That there's so many things that migrate, and if they don't, the climate does. And so we have to be internationalist in what we do. But nonetheless, there is still stuff to do on your own patch where you can take your own decisions. And that's what I'm suggesting.
As you were saying right at the beginning, what seems to be very interesting, however, is that post-Brexit, we will have a much more lively conversation on lots of environmental and scientific issues because the bodies inside the UK will have the power to change policy in a way that they haven't had inside the EU. So in other words, these things will be much less abstract and will be much more in our face, and these arguments are going to be much livelier, and I think will be a bigger part of our politics afterwards. Lady here. Hand up.
Rosemary Smith, RTS. Do you think it would ever be possible to actually go back to have in-house producers? Because I was watching a program the other day where several councils discovered actually the quality and the cost was better by having the services in-house rather than outsourced.
Well, it's very difficult to give a sweeping argument to that because the services are across such a broad scale. I mean, there's makeup and on one hand, scenery on the hand, studios on the other hand, all kinds of things. And in my time, when it was all in-house, we thought we were the only people who knew how to do any of these things. We both, I'm sure, have seen that the loss of the studios in the television centre, which is where I worked, which were the biggest custom design studios in the world, that those in the end became unwanted, and to do the sort of shows, many of the shows, we go to the South Bank, and the South Bank puts on the programmes there, both the BBC and ITV and the other networks, and that seems to make sense. And I mean, to be honest, the first time I went, I was in a sort of rather childish, sort of prudish sort of way. Well, these people, in my time, we had a BBC, and we did in our time. Well, I've grown out of that because it was silly, actually. And there is place in the marketplace for independent operators to provide services which the BBC, specialist services, and other broadcasters can take use of. It's not cut and dried. It's not a whole-scale argument, but those should exist, I'm sure.
If I could just jump in for 1 second on the same thing, because I said earlier on, quite an upset tone, that we had lost all these history and arts documentary producers and makers from Bristol and elsewhere. And I was upset because they are my friends. But I've made documentaries in-house and out-house. I've worked with lots of indies and these wonderful, wonderful creative people in the indies. The only thing I would say about the BBC people I've been working with is that they were working with very, very small budgets by documentary standards, an embarrassingly gurning and overacting presenter they had to deal with. And they worked harder and they cut corners and they did things that were really quite remarkable. There wasn't enough money for costumes from time to time for some of the drama bits, so they went out to second-hand shops and got it. They couldn't pay for enough actors sometimes, so secretaries and PAs would turn up and do their bit. I mean, they really cut every corner. They worked incredibly long hours. And in my view, and we always stayed at the cheapest hotels. We made every pound to go further. And that, I suppose, is why I still feel quite upset that they lost their jobs as a result, because they seemed to me they were going the extra mile.
Thank you.
Hi, Sir David. Just want to say what a huge privilege it is to be here today. Over the years, you've just made so many amazing programs that are kind of each more visually stunning than the last. And a less technically minded question, but I was wondering, when you're approaching something like Planet Earth 2, how do you kind of adhere to kind of the same broadcasting principles of showing nature, but kind of creating something that's like modern and visually stunning and innovative each time?
Well, let me first of all make a disavowal. I am the most insignificant contributor to Planet Earth 2, although my name is at the top. I mean, the people who make the program, Planet Earth 2, are first the cameramen, of which there are 25 or 30, and then come the directors, and my bit, which is adding the words and so on, comes right at the end. And I didn't conceive that program, but the people who did conceive it are working both for, and it's financed both for, not just domestic television, but overseas television, BBC Worldwide. And BBC Worldwide have got one of their own staff high up there who is taking important decisions on how it should be done. And I would think that the knowledge that we have to be responsible not only to our own audience, but also to sending it overseas is very powerful. Now you may say, oh, in that case, it's the beginning of the end, is it not? Well, in this instance, it is not, because fortunately, those kind of natural history documentaries have standards which are visible around the world. And the BBC created them, and the BBC maintains them, and we would lose customers if we lost that sort of standards. And so they work very hard at it.
There's a lady with the red hat on.
Hello, my name's Joy. Just want to say it's a massive privilege to be here today. So it's not, political related question. It's actually more kind of like a personal one. So in terms of like your career and how you've been so successful at what you've always done. Is there one piece of advice that you feel, you've sort of held on to? So I suppose if you could do it all over again, what's that one thing that you think you would keep consistent with and, sort of pass on to other people?
You mean as someone who is involved who puts their face on television, on natural history television?
Yeah, so, sorry, I would love to make documentaries, so it's more of a...
My advice would be not to stand between the camera and the animal too frequently.
That's a good one. But more in terms of your success and how you've obviously kept it going and stayed, at the top of your game, and, what's that one thing that that you'd pass on to people like me who just aspire to have half the career that you've had?
There are many different kinds of natural history television programs. And there are those in which the personality of the presenter and the knowledge of the presenter is very much the selling point of the program. And they appear a high proportion of the airtime. They are in vision. That has its own qualities and its own audience. And there's some very good ones. But at the other end of the spectrum, the sort of programs which I tend to do, where in fact I don't appear at all, in which the animals are the stars. Now actually, that's more expensive. From the television, from the controllers or budgeters' point of view, that's a very expensive form of television, because in spite of what you think about my noble colleague here, snow leopards are even more difficult than dealing with him.
And if I may say so, I look forward to editions of the Andrew Marr in which the presenter doesn't appear at all and all the attention is on the animals.
Quite so.
There's
So there's no room.
one gentleman at the back there who had his hand up. Yes, you, sir. The black cap on.
Good evening, James Cordell, RTS Best Recipient. Good evening, everybody. My question is, obviously, with the recent competition between, services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and even YouTube to some degree, I was wondering your opinions on basically that. What sort of content do you reckon television is sort of missing? That's sort of questioning whether TV is going to sort of survive for the long run.
I didn't get that, did you?
In this new world of Netflix and so forth, what are we not doing now that we should be doing for the long term? What are the areas we are missing?
You mean in broadcasting as a whole?
Yes.
Oh, golly.
Sorry.
I don't know. I'll put it this, can I turn the question round?
Yes.
And say that I think, personally, that we're doing too many actuality shows, and important though they are, there are other things like cooking and so on, and gardening, which are very good and certainly should be in the channel, in the network, but which we are doing rather too much of. And we are also doing a lot of drama, which I personally, as an excellent network controller, would think we are doing too much of. Not because there's anything wrong in themselves. They're all absolutely excellent in their right way. But we are nudging out, and we aren't exploring new things and new subjects enough, for my book.
And again, if I can just jump in very, very quick, and then I'll bring in John. We are living through an age of extraordinary scientific renaissance. This is the most exciting time to be alive when it comes to science, when it comes to material science, microbial science, deep science and planets. We do some of it, in my view, not nearly enough. John Mayer. John Mayer here, sorry.
So David, a couple of questions. Who is the next David Attenborough? And secondly, take to your desert island the 5 best programs of the last 60 years that you've seen.
The five best programs?
You can have 10 if you want.
5 best programs of what?
That you've ever seen in the last 60 years.
That I've seen?
Yes.
In television, not in natural history?
No.
Porridge. Absolutely top of almost anything. I mean, it seems to me drama, comedy, deep insight into human personalities, causes you to think, magnificently played, perfectly cast. I don't know a better series on television. I'll let you have the other 4.
And the next David Attenborough? Who's that?
I'm not sure that there's need for one, actually. No, really. I mean, I've been there a long time, and I give commentaries in ways that were fashioned 30, 40, 50 years ago. Writing, a lot of people can write, but they aren't being allowed to, and they aren't being encouraged to write for film commentaries in the way that they used to do 40 years ago. There aren't a lot of people who write the sort of documentary way that I try to do. I don't know whether you'd agree.
Your great, if I may say, your great skill is knowing where the silences are.
Well, that's right.
Not writing too many words,
Yes.
just enough to take you through that piece.
That's right. And certainly, I used to have, when I would occasionally talk to people, I used to say that there are only about 5 reasons why a natural history presenter should be envisioned. And one was that people like to know who it is who's talking. A second was that he could paragraph usefully. The third was that he could give an indication of whether it's hot or cold, or whether it's frightening or dangerous, or whatever. That's 3. And there was a very important one, which is that occasionally you have to talk in generalities in natural science programs. And if you start talking about altruism and community life and you show bees, people think they're just talking about bees. You aren't, you're talking about something much more widespread than that. And if you show a specific animal, then you're in trouble. So that's when the narrator can actually talk about an abstract idea, and if he's any good, explain it. But if you put a man in vision for anything other than those reasons, and maybe one or two others, then you're actually just taking the easy way out. You're also taking the cheaper way out, because it's cheaper just to fill in the time that way with the narrator. But certainly my standards and going, there's not a commentary that I haven't written, I think there are not too many words. There are too many words in most of them. I've tried to cut them down.
The gentleman in the beard.
Hello, Sir David. Last week you were in my home region announcing the start of the building of the Sir David Attenborough, which of course, as we all know, should have been Boaty McBoatface. My question is to you. I was in Nepal last week in the jungle, and I was fortunate enough to be about 30 feet away from a one-horned rhino. The experience I got was absolutely mesmerizing and once in a lifetime. I would love to hear which single experience from your career has been the one moment which you just cannot get out of your mind?
The first time I put on a sub-aqua gear and dived on a coral reef. And not only, for those of us who, we all know diving is in itself an extraordinary experience. Simply to be able to move in 3 dimensions just by flicking the pivot is a wonderful liberation. But to see 150 animals that species you've never seen before, of the most amazing shapes and colours, dazzling brilliance, entirely unafraid of you, except when you're right on top of them, and you just go on and big things come to that. That was one of the most transportative, transforming experience of my life.
Thank you.
We have time for a single final question, and gentleman here has had his hand up for a while.
Since you were the controller of BBC Two, Sir David, the international dynamic of television has changed beyond recognition. I was wondering if actually both you and if there's time, Andrew as well, could reflect on your views on the role of the BBC internationally in comparison, say, to Russia today, which is far more state-controlled. You know, how do you think it forms international public opinion of life in Britain?
How do I think international public...
Yes, how is the BBC doing internationally, BBC
the BBC
Worldwide?
Internationally, they still think of us almost as Reithian, it seems to me, and they don't know what you poor people have to endure for much of the time. But I would have thought that internationally most people think that the BBC still is what broadcasting is about and what it should aspire to.
Absolutely, and of course it is a different world from Russia today, which is a straightforward propaganda channel for Vladimir Putin. Whatever you think of the BBC, I don't think anyone would call it a straightforward propaganda channel for Theresa May. The only thing I would say, and I mean this is a personal thing, I feel when I watch our own 24-hour news coverage worldwide from hotel rooms around the world, or almost anybody else's, that in 24/7 news coverage, there is far too much repetition and far too long on a single story. What I want is one story after another, after another, after another, constantly updated. And it's bloody hard work, but I think none of us do quite enough of it.
And Andrew, you're not Vladimir Putin.
And I'm not quite Vladimir Putin. Though I have been genuinely mistaken for Vladimir Putin. Not least by the Queen. I'll tell that story. It's a true story. She was with Putin in the open carriage coming from here to the Buckingham Palace. And because it was an open carriage and there's a translator there, everyone could see the two of them were talking all the way through, going up the Mall. And a friend of mine who worked in the palace at the time said that when she came down from the palace, one of her aides said, "Your Majesty, you were talking to Russian President very, very, very vigorously all the way through. Can I ask what you were talking about?" And she said, I can't remember. I was just trying to say to myself all the time that this is the President of Russia and not that chap here from the BBC. By which I fear she meant. Anyway, thank you all very much indeed. We're going to have a little moment from the chair of RTS.
Thank you. Well, at its best, television is just an extraordinary flashpoint for the big issues in our society, and including the emotional connection, the ethical questions, and then massive issues of society. And I can think of no greater example of this than the two gentlemen that we have, and I want to thank, first of all, Andrew hugely for being here and for chairing so eloquently and wonderfully. So thank you. And Sir David, I can't thank you enough for your time that spent giving some fantastic, wonderfully candid insights and perspectives. They are all treasured by all of us. We have a little thank you from the Royal Television Society, which is in honour of your role as a Vice President. And a thank you for doing this for us. Thank you so much, Sir David.
Thank you very much indeed.